There's this huge billboard in the heart of New York City that's had just one thing on it for the last 34 years. A real-time tally of the United States federal debt.
32,801,929,000,000.
But nobody seems to care. I mean, maybe it doesn't have the best placement, it's in this kind of weird alley, but these people are literally taking selfies right next to it. But the real debt, those trillions of real dollars the government owes to people, not just these numbers on a sign, politicians worry about that, right? Well, they do in their campaigns.
We have debt on debt on debt.
I like debt for me. I don't like debt for the country.
We cannot simply spend as we please. And that's why today I'm pledging to cut the deficit we inherited by half by the end of my first term in office.
$2 trillion increase in the national debt. $2 trillion. And if I'm president, it will not happen. It will not happen.
But once they're elected, most presidents, especially the recent ones, just add way more debt.
The motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.
Reconciliation Act of 2001 is agreed to.
Excuse me, ma'am. Sorry, could I just ask one question? What is your take on the national debt right now, 32.5?
I don't have time to talk.
Okay.
I don't know how that'll ever get paid off. So is it kind of like a made-up concept? Like,
they need to make more money. Ain't it made?
And it's made. Does this worry you at all?
No.
So who does care? Well, old people.
Oh, it's awful. It's awful. And it's my grandchildren that are going to have to deal with it.
We're both over 50, so it's different for us. We're okay, but it's the grandbabies, all four of them, that are going to have a problem as they get older.
When you ask Americans what issues the president should focus on, there's these gaps that show up between the old and the young. But almost always, young people just care less, with one notable exception. So do our elders know something we don't, or are we right not to care? This series explains the issues with the biggest gaps to help you answer the question, who cares? Before you draw any conclusions about the debt, let's make sure you fully understand it. We'll use one of these as an example, a stimulus check. As you can see, written right on it, it's straight from the US Treasury. That's the government just giving away money. But all that money didn't come from taxes. So where did it come from? Well, it starts here, a newly signed law. This one is huge. 135 pages in, you find this, $1,400 checks for anyone who meets some standards. All of those checks together cost $401 billion. But the US government doesn't just have that sitting around, so they have to ask for it. So the US Treasury, which is in charge of actually getting that money, comes out and is like,
so who wants to give me some money?
If you give me $100 today, I'll give you $175 in 30 years. The US has always paid people back, so a lot of people are willing to give them money. Some of those people are from foreign countries like Japan, China, and the UK, which are currently the biggest foreign holders of debt. But most of the money comes from people in the United States. For example, if you invest your money into a mutual fund, they might be giving some of that money to the government to pay back more later. To make sure the US remembers to pay that money back, they hand out these things called treasuries, which give the terms of the debt. Depending on how long it takes to get your money back, they have different names.
It's a mix of notes, bonds, and bills.
Oh, and that's Andrew. He's gonna help explain the debt. Anyway, so the Treasury gets all this money from people, and that's debt. Money the government owes to people later. So now that the Treasury has this money, it can use it. In this case, the Treasury just repackages the debt into checks, debit cards, and direct deposits and sends it to people. Now people can use that money to help pay their bills, or buy a new phone, or maybe they'll just rip it up.
We also want to show you a rather grim sign of our times. It's not far from here in Midtown Manhattan. The national debt has grown too large for the national debt clock.
We had to squeeze everything together.
Okay, so that's where the debt comes from. But why does it keep going up? Well, it actually hasn't always. Like, look here.
We saw concerted efforts by Congress and by President George H.W. Bush and by President Clinton to reduce debt levels and deficit levels. And thanks in part to some of those efforts and to the dot-com boom in the late 1990s, we actually saw federal surpluses in the late 1990s.
In 2000, the US debt started going down. The debt clock read $5.7 trillion and the numbers started dropping. There's this great article from CBS about it that came out when this was happening. Barring an unexpected reversal in Washington's newfound sense of fiscal responsibility. Basically, as long as the government doesn't start spending more than it has again, which would be crazy, the national debt clock will go dark on September 7th, 2000. And the Clinton administration was celebrating too.
Now it's official that this year, well ahead of the most ambitious schedule, America has balanced the budget. America can now turn off the deficit clock.
So the owners of the sign said, our work here is done, and unplugged the sign. And they covered it with this patriotic, sideways French flag looking thing.
When Mr. Bush came to office, a substantial sum, but every year that number went up and up and up.
Nothing lasts forever. 3 fiscal years passed with a budget surplus. The government was making money. Then the second George Bush takes office. He passes tax cuts and spending increases, especially on the military, and that curtain reluctantly comes off and the debt climbs again. Through either spending more or lowering taxes, or both, each president since Bill Clinton has added a significant amount to the national debt. Over $32 trillion of debt officially, and if you include the amount that is technically owed by future Social Security and Medicare payments, the figure could be up to $160 trillion. So is that a problem? Well, it depends who you ask.
There are members of both parties that agree our debt and deficit levels are unsustainable. Where Republicans and Democrats often disagree is over whether you should cut government spending or increase taxes.
Of course, our finances need to be on a sustainable long-run path. Interest payments on that debt relative to GDP have not gone up at all. So I do believe we have more fiscal space.
Kids walk out of high school over gun violence prevention. You see kids walk out of high school over climate change prevention. When it comes to national debt, we have to behave the same way.
The more debt we have for the existing government we have, the less flexibility we have to build the government we want.
I don't think anyone seriously thinks that the debt could be infinite. But the question is, how close are we to a problem? And what would that problem actually be? Older generations have seen the debt skyrocket in their lifetimes and have seen the impacts of inflation and recession. Young people just haven't seen that as much. Regardless, the national debt is a bipartisan issue that the country faces and one that will definitely be talked about in the 2024 election. Some candidates have already given their strategy.
I want to think on the timescales of history. How do we deliver GDP growth in this country? And how do we actually restore some sense of fiscal discipline?
Vivek Ramaswamy hopes he can increase revenue through economic prosperity, but it's not clear that would actually be enough to address the massive deficit. And how he's going to make the economy so prosperous is also unclear. Joe Biden has bragged about how much he's lowered spending.
All the talk about the deficit from my Republican friends, I love it. I've reduced it $350 billion in my first year in office. And we're on track to reduce it by the end of September by another $1.5 trillion.
But that's also coming from disproportionately high COVID spending in the Trump years. He does continually support ensuring rich people pay their taxes, but he has also increased spending in various areas of the government. Donald Trump campaigned in 2016 saying he would slash the debt.
We better get rid of the debt, and we better straighten ourselves out.
But increased it in just 4 years, almost as much as Barack Obama did in 8. Largely through big tax cuts for businesses. He did add taxes on imported goods, tariffs, but they didn't raise anywhere near enough revenue to offset the spending his government oversaw as he defended Social Security spending and expanded the military. Ron DeSantis complains about the US spending too much money.
Washington has borrowed, spent, and printed trillions and trillions of dollars since March of 2020. And really, the bill has come due in the form of the average person having to pay a lot more for the necessities of life.
But in Florida, where he served as governor, he recently signed the largest budget in the state's history. RFK Jr. speaks about reducing military spending and talks about the challenges of funding Social Security.
And I don't think we can afford to be policemen of the world anymore. We have 800 bases around the world. We need to start rebuilding our middle class at home. We need to be responsible with our debt.
But also says he will not make any cuts to Social Security or healthcare entitlements. There's a lot on the table when it comes to the national debt. Politicians have some ideas that they talk about, but recently they haven't really been doing anything to really solve the problem. That will only matter, though, if someone cares to hold them accountable. But who cares? Do you?